Wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. It is 10 o'clock on the dot. Good morning. Welcome, welcome. We are going to begin the Religious Leaders on Solitary Confinement press conference, and I will let our Executive Director, Kim Bobo, begin, and then King Salim Khalfani, we're very happy to have him as our criminal justice reform organizer, will be taking it from there. And Kim may be running around like she said, so if she's here, we'd love to hear a few words from you.
All righty. Well, I am again grateful for everyone joining us, and this is such an important issue. It is a faith issue. It is a values concern, and so we're really here today to lift up those concerns, those values, and the timing could not be more perfect, given that the issue is being considered at 8:30 tomorrow morning. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Kim. Solitary confinement in Virginia, according to the Virginia Department of Corrections' own numbers, more than 7,000 people incarcerated in Virginia prisons were placed in solitary confinement between 2018 and 2019. And that number does not include those who have been placed in solitary confinement through other types of housing units in Virginia. For those who may not know, solitary confinement is the isolation of a person in a jail or prison cell for all or nearly all day, with little environmental stimulation or opportunity for human interaction. Virginia has an issue, and we are supporting Senate Bill 108 that is patroned and co-patroned by State Senator Joseph Morrissey and State Senator Jill Vogel. And so we want to reduce the use of solitary confinement in Virginia. The religious leaders and religious organizations have taken the lead on this all over the country. In fact, we have statements from the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Quakers, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Catholic Church, Church of the Brethren, Jewish, United Methodist, United Church of Christ, Unitarian Universalist, Presbyterian, Muslim, the Virginia Church of God in Christ, Episcopalians, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, to name a few. So at this time, the Virginia Interfaith Center is taking the lead with the faith community to reduce solitary confinement. We had a bill, Senate Bill 108 last year, and it was killed in committee. We hope to fare much better in 2022. So our first speaker will be Bishop Philip Green, overseer of the General Board Quarters, Church of God in Christ.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you on today. Words of Jesus from the book of Luke, 18th chapter, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and to recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." It is with Jesus' joy that I come to you, representing the clergy of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I stand with the clerical call for the end to solitary confinement in all Virginia correctional facilities. Solitary confinement is a form of torture. Undeniably, the practice of solitary confinement leads to a host of collateral consequences that will often extend the amount of time prisoners will spend incarcerated and risk their lives as they endure the well-known psychological stress of isolation. The traumatic impacts of solitary confinement are far-reaching, and any time spent in solitary increases the likelihood that a person will die prematurely after their release from incarceration. Many in our prison need mental health care. The Virginia Department of Corrections report that 26% of prisoners have mental health issues. Prisoners in solitary confinement are diagnosed with a range of disorders such as bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder because of abuse, manic depression, and schizophrenic. Amid other mental illnesses such as detrimental outcomes can and should be avoided. It is unacceptable to criminalize and imprison people suffering from significant mental illness, addiction, and the impacts of poverty. It is equally wrong for our prison systems to cause mental health issues. I firmly believe that solitary confinement is itself a form of violence and torture. We call on you, Virginia General Assembly, to follow the example of states such as New Mexico, Colorado, Maine, and New York, and end solitary confinement in Virginia. Hebrews 13:3 admonishes us to remember those who are in prison, and those in prison with them, and those who are ministered or mistreated. And today we urge you to do the same. Blessings and peace be upon each and every one of you.
Thank you, Bishop Green. Next, we'll hear from the Reverend Emmanuel Harris, who is president of the Baptist Ministers Conference of Richmond and vicinity. Reverend Harris.
Thank you so much for this time. As Bishop Green has just stated, we understand that the issue of incarceration, many people have mental health issues, and I would even go further to say, when it comes to the poor community, think about undiagnosed mental health issues. We gave numbers of 20%, but when you think about the undiagnosed mental health issues, that number is far greater. And oftentimes, this bill, the Senate bill that's going into that's proposed, it's to give medical evaluation to people instead of just, because often the treatment for poor people with mental health issues is to lock them up. And without adequate treatment, and this solitary confinement is another way to further damage somebody's psyche when they've already been severely damaged. I myself in 2020, December 31st, had COVID-19, which forced me to stay in this room for 20 days. And I've been doing prison ministry for 29 years, but in that 20-day period, I got a better understanding of what it's like to be confined to. No one else in my house had COVID, so I was into this room, and the mental effect of that after 20 days really, even if you had a health issue, you thought no one would hear you, and no one would help you, and you're by yourself. And so just imagine people who have been in solitary confinement for years. They've been locked up in these environments for 30 days, 60 days, and even, off and on for a year. And just imagine the psychological impact of that on an individual who's probably already been abused, already been locked in poverty, already been not afforded opportunity for education, probably already had unjust trials, just a plethora of issues. So I would just say that, this bill is a positive step in the right direction when it comes to ending solitary confinement. There's some restrictions in it about, for protection. You can voluntarily do it, if, for your own protection. But it also involves mental evaluation by professionals. Instead of just using this haphazardly in a really destructive way to further increase damage to individuals who probably already have been severely damaged all their lives. So I just think that this is just another way to say, hey, we have to treat people in a humane fashion. As the bishop already said, we have to remember that this is somebody's child. We have to remember that, we have to always err on the side of mercy, err on the side of grace, err on the side of humanity. And we often, just we often don't do that. We often just lock people up, throw away the key, don't give them proper treatment, don't give them proper health care, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this bill is just a step in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Reverend Harris. We have a person in Virginia who spent 17 and 1/2 years in solitary confinement. And we have examples like that all over. So next, we're going to hear from Rabbi Michael Nah, who is the rabbi of Temple Beth El. Rabbi Nah.
Good morning. We're gathered this morning as faith leaders and people of conscience calling for an end to solitary confinement in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we're urging our legislators to pass Senate Bill 108, which would require Virginia prisons and jails to consider humane alternatives before implementing solitary confinement. Let's be clear about one simple fact. Solitary confinement is torture. Think about it. This form of punishment typically involves being held in a cell without human contact for between 22 to 24 hours a day. Some prisoners face these conditions for extremely long periods of time, months, years, even decades. Is it any wonder that inmates in solitary confinement are far more prone to suicides and suicide attempts? Indeed, the debilitating effects of solitary confinement are obvious and well documented. And to add insult to injury, most inmates are not put in isolation as part of their sentence for their crime, but punishment for a disciplinary action, most often a nonviolent infraction, while incarcerated. Too often, inmates are placed in solitary confinement without even being granted a fair hearing. As a rabbi, I want to state unequivocally that solitary confinement is a violation of scriptural values, and I believe an affront to God. The first 2 chapters of the Bible teach that every human being is created in God's image, and that no human being should be alone. The degrading practice of solitary confinement defies these core principles, and it also contravenes one of the Bible's central moral teachings expressed in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, love your neighbor as yourself. And these core values influenced both American and international law, both of which ban cruel and unusual punishment and guarantee due process because of the infinite and equal value of every single person. And it's why the United Nations has repeatedly asserted that prolonged isolation for more than 15 days is torture. But in Virginia, prisoners are routinely held in solitary confinement for months, years, and even decades. This is state-sponsored torture, happening right now as we speak, on our watch, and in all of our names, and it must end. Senate Bill 108 is a good first step in the direction of ending this form of torture once and for all. We urge all Virginians of conscience to join us in demanding our legislators pass SB 108. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Nah. Next, we will hear from the Reverend Ashley Mejia, co-pastor of the Voices of Jubilee at Bon Air Juvenile Detention. Reverend Mejia.
Good morning. We are here this morning, as others have said, to proclaim our support for the important Senate Bill 108. And again, as others have said, in conjunction with that, we are here to declare our clear opposition to torture. I'm here as part of the Presbyterian Church USA, and we have resoundingly opposed this prolonged practice. We oppose solitary confinement. We oppose administrative segregation. We oppose restrictive housing. We oppose this form of violence and isolation under any name. And we stand, all of us today, with the UN's 2015 ruling that solitary confinement should be imposed only in extraordinary circumstances, and that this prolonged solitary confinement of more than 15 days is a form of torture. But we are in a legislative session, and if we must talk about the value of reducing solitary confinement in terms of dollars, solitary confinement is in practice more costly for taxpayers. While it has been claimed that ending this practice, and let me be clear, we are talking about ending a form of torture, would be too expensive, the truth is that solitary confinement is extremely resource intensive from start to finish. It requires increased prison staffing, space, and resources. Reducing the use of solitary confinement would ultimately reduce costs. But as solitary confinement slips quickly into the territory of human rights violations, we ask the Commonwealth to consider this not as an issue of budgets, but as an issue of our moral and spiritual center. As people of faith, we believe in the full dignity of all of us. We are all children of God. And that remains true when a person is taken inside the border of the prison wall. The desolating impact of the conditions of solitary confinement have long been known, long been documented. Solitary has been condemned by US presidents, the Pope, Supreme Court justices. The United Nations has called it degrading and cruel, and it's been described as death in life and living in the grave by those who have experienced it. And yet, we are still here today, thinking about change, while Virginians are at this very moment suffering in isolations in our prisons and jails. This should trouble us to action. When human beings are subject to the devastation of the very core of who they are, and we know that it's happening, we are all accountable. So as such, we join our brothers and sisters of faith and all builders of the beloved community in challenging this practice. And we ask today that the Commonwealth would stop this practice of state-sanctioned violence, that we would end the use of solitary confinement and move towards more restorative, humane alternatives now.
Thank you very much, Reverend Ashley. Next, we're going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Leo Whitaker, who is Executive Minister of the Baptist General Convention of Virginia. Dr. Whitaker.
Thank you, sir. To my clergy persons who have gathered here on this call, and to the persons who are participating with us in this press conference, we bring you greetings from the Baptist General Convention of Virginia, 1,079 churches, 29 associations throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Today, I want to begin my presentation by simply saying, in all of creation, the divine looked at everything that was there and only made one post-creation improvement. He simply looked at everything that was there and said, God looked at everything that was there and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. So he made a helpmate. If in all of creation and all that God has done, if God could look at a way of improving humanity and implement someone to be with Adam, it is a statement to each of us that no one needs to be alone. I've served as a chaplain in many hospitals, but one dear hospital is the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters. And one of the processes when in the neonatal intensive care unit, where Dr. Northam served as a physician, a process is called kangaroo, when a premature baby is so small and so fragile that one of the therapy that is done is to allow the baby to be placed on mother's or father's chest without clothes. So the bond of the mother's heartbeat, the father's skin, could be an inspiration for the child to thrive, to live, to be, to know that he is loved. Our scripture tells us in Psalm 133, behold, how good and pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. That is not an isolation statement. That is a call for community, a call for the village, a call for persons to gather and to celebrate the humanity in each individual. As an emphasis for the hospital for many years, we always raise the question when there is an ethical dilemma, what ought we to do? What is the thing that's not so much right or wrong, your opinion or my opinion, but what is it that we ought to do? Well, if you use the virtual model of looking at every individual created in the image and the imago Dei of a God who loves all, and a God who did not want to see Adam suffer and bring Eve to him, a God that created male, female, a God that created all persons, that for us to recreate creation is a demonic force all by itself. For us to rearrange and destroy the principal grace that God gives for all people to exist, to live, to be, to thrive, is an act of inhumane treatment one to the other. Was it not the poet who said that no person is an island? And I use the word no person so that my language would be inclusive. There are times when solitary confinement are done not only for men, but for women, not only for women, but for children. None of us would want anyone to treat us in this manner. If you want to show love, you show it by treating people as you ought to be treated, as you desire to be treated, as you want to be treated. So the Baptist General Convention is 1,079 churches across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Stand with the faith community, those who are voicing their concerns today, and others who will be walking with us through the halls of the General Assembly, talking to our elected officials and asking them that we don't want you to be alone and isolating yourself from the reality of life. We need each person to remember that there is someone who's human, who needs to be in a public place or even in an institution in a public place in order to thrive. My brother and my sisters of the General Assembly, we want you to support our Senate Bill 108 and be behind those who are endorsing it and those who are sponsoring it, and upon the work of the faith community whose hands are on it to bless it. We offer you our grace and we thank you that the human touch provides life. Let's do away with solitary confinement.
Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. At this time, if the news media has any questions for any of the religious leaders or the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, they can put it in the chat. And someone asked in the chat, who in the world would oppose this bill? And what was the argument that led to the bill being buried last year? And I would say that they had the Department of Planning and Budget put a cost on reducing solitary confinement at $41 million. While we looked at other states, some of the speakers alluded to this, that everyone that either eliminated an institution that was based on solitary confinement or the use thereof saved millions and millions of dollars that could be used in some other form. In Virginia, the Virginia Department of Corrections is the largest part of the budget. And that says a lot about where our priorities are. Aisha?
I was going to add that if anybody else would like to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand using the React button. And then I will enable your microphone and we'll be able to hear your question. There's another question in the chat as well. How do you all respond to the Department of Corrections claims that they've ended the practice of solitary confinement? That is from Benjamin Pavier.
Well, I would respond that Harold Clark, who has been reaffirmed by by Governor-elect Youngkin, has said vociferously that Virginia no longer uses solitary confinement. And as Reverend Mejia said, that they call it restrictive housing, segregation, and they're even using restorative justice and calling them restorative housing. And so you can change the name, but the practice is still the same. It's solitary confinement. And so what we say is solitary confinement still exists. And you can ask those who are incarcerated persons whether it exists or not. And they have given much testimony that you can change the name, but the practice is still the same.
I just wanted to add that the practice of imposing prolonged periods of isolation is also often used as a protective measure. So LGBTQ people, young children often who are in adult facilities, so 17, 18, 19-year-olds, the elderly are often put in this kind of isolation, not as a means of punishment, but as a means of protecting them. However, the impact, the distress that all of our panelists today described is precisely the same. In fact, some of the young folks that our organization has relationships with have called late at night from, they call it the SHU and some of the segregated housing unit, in deep despair because they have had to make a choice between remaining on their unit and feeling like they were in imminent danger of violence, or going into segregated housing where they would suffer in isolation. And they chose segregated housing, but that had such dire impact on their emotional and physical and spiritual well-being that it's really an impossible choice. So when the department says they've ended solitary, it really doesn't mean much to me.
Does anyone else?
Might I add that it's important to note that any language, a change of the language does not change the practice. and that we need to also make sure that the law of the land supports those changes in the institutions, so that the institution does not seek to wiggle out of the practice or stay in the practice while the General Assembly seeks to not address the issue, to give persons in institutions the right to create isolating situations for inmates. In other words, we want both the language and the practice to be done away with, and we want to make sure that people are treated with humane approaches that each person needs to have. If the goal of incarceration is to repay for the acts that cause one to be placed there, or if it is for rehabilitation and restoration, then the acts of inclusion and the acts of education and the acts of being a part of the group will help persons to move towards their better selves.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to ditto what everybody else said. It's just important that this becomes law. What you don't want is people to say, hey, we don't do this. But then in selected instances, it can come back. You remember years ago, we were trying to get the felony threshold moved from 200 to much higher. And they said, well, we don't charge them like that most of the time. But the reality is they did charge some people like that, right? and what we're saying is that it shouldn't be an option. We don't leave it up to the choice of somebody. We want it to be the law of the land, that this is not even an option. Take this totally off the table. It's already been said, they will use cost as a reason sometimes. And the truth of the matter is a couple of lies that just really get to me. It costs money to lock people up. And you often have people locked up who are non-violent, non-threatening, who haven't had infractions or incidents in 20 or 30 years, and they still lock them up. And when you let them out, they said you're letting out violent criminals when somebody's obviously changed their entire life. They use a lot of fundamental, and cost is one of those things that it costs money. Think about staffing. You got to have somebody, right? As opposed to watching several people. So, money is a thing that whenever they push on money, we need to push back, because you can release a lot of people and you wouldn't have a need. But the truth of the matter is this is a $1 billion industry. There are people who don't want people free because they make a lot of money off of mass incarceration. That hasn't changed since the 80s. So I'll just stop right there. But sorry, I got a little.
And let me add this analogy. In order to hold a man down in a hole, another man must be in the hole with him. And none of us have ever thought about the issue of the impact of the correction officers, staff members, chaplains, physicians, nurses, persons who work there, who must also be in confinement with the person who is in isolation at any given time, and the amount of energy and efforts and the wear and tear of their human factor, their human being, and how it erodes their connection with the community. And so this is not just to improve the quality of the inmate, the citizens who are doing time there, but it is also to improve the quality of those persons who've given their life work and service to the care of the citizens who are in correction facilities.
We need all of these voices and this rationale at that committee meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30. And that's the thing. When people talk about the public participating, when you have meetings at subcommittees at 7 and committees at 8 and 9, it's very hard for the public to participate. The Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy advocates social, economic, and racial justice in Virginia's policies and practices through education, which is what has happened here this morning, prayer, which happens all the time, and action. We must take action. We must participate. no participation, we'll have no right to cry and moan, because these things are done in our names.
I would like to say that also this is another instance of I cannot breathe. And when you put someone in this predicament, it knows their five senses. God gave us five senses so that these senses could be activated. And so when you are only able to be in a small area, it nullifies the sight of vision. You cannot see yourself outside of the condition in which you find yourself. When you speak, there is no one to hear your voice. There is no smell other than the smell that you desire not to have. And there's no one to touch. And of course, all of our five senses are very necessary for us to live and survive in the world in which God created us. And so all of the creative abilities that are inside of us as man and female, we are unable to use those abilities that God has given unto us. And so this is something that we should not allow to take place in our world, even though all of us have made mistakes, and many have made have done things that we should be locked up for. But by the grace of God, we are free and we are able to experience life. And I had the same testimony as Dr. Harris had, in that even on last year during the Christmas holiday, I had COVID. And so it gave me an opportunity to realize that even I was in a separate room. My wife was in a separate room. I have a family member that lives with me, and my other two children, they live outside of the home. But for the first time in my life, I was not able to spend Christmas with my family, my brothers and sisters and my nieces and nephews, and we have a large family. So I was experiencing isolation. And so we had a turkey, but I had to eat it by myself. And so it is a whole different set of circumstances that and you see how things are going in our world today. Even from the beginning of the pandemic, nobody wanted to stay home. Everybody wanted to continue to do life as usual. But the circumstances required us to make sure that we not only look out for ourselves, but even for our neighbor. You have to do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. And so this is something that we need to share and to give special attention to, because every man is created equal. And so I thank you for this time of allowing us to share.
Well, I want to say on behalf of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy, thank you so much, Bishop Green, Reverend Harris, Reverend Mahias, Dr. Whitaker, Rabbi Knopf, and we thank you so much because you've given us inspiration, motivation, and we're fired up. We're going to join our staff at the Virginia General Assembly shortly. They've been up there since early in the morning working on these various and sundry issues and speaking on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. So thank you to the staff, the board, and thank you so much to the religious leaders who shared today and did a work of public education that we will carry forward for the future.
May I ask one request?
Aisha? Yes, sir.
Will your staff take this press conference video and send it to every General Assembly persons and their staff throughout the Commonwealth so that they can hear it and listen to it as well, and allow them to know that those of us who are part of the voting processes will do what we have to do to support them, and that we want them to listen to this as a time for them to focus on this particular bill.
Yes.
I will do you one better. We've actually got our staff up there right now who has been going door to door and telling them about this press conference, putting it on their calendars. So
Yeah. Our delegate, and I meant to mention this again, I said in the Senate, we have Joe Morrissey and Jill Vogel, who are co-patroned. And in the House of Delegates, we have Delegate Cliff Hayes out of Chesapeake.
Yes.
And Cliff says, thank you all for this important work. I have a House bill to address this as well. And it has not been assigned a bill number yet, but I will share the bill number at the appropriate time. And I must tell you, Cliff Hayes said that his heart was so troubled. He texted me in the middle of the night to say, I will patron this bill. And I see Cliff is here with us. And thank you, Cliff, Delegate Hayes, for taking the time to participate with us today. I don't think Cliff can speak yet, but do we have time?
Yes, I've actually highlighted him. He's right here popping on.
Okay.
Welcome, Delegate Hayes.
Well, good morning, everyone, and my apologies. The feed is somewhat unstable where I am. So rather than to try to pull the video in and have problems with you hearing me, I'll just leave it just for the audio only. I just want to thank you all for the great work that you're doing in this very, very, very important situation in the jails here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I know the great work that the Virginia Interfaith Center has been doing over the years, even my introduction to your work, my very first session as Pastor Dr. Whitaker at the time, I think he was the chair statewide, came over to see a horrible situation in South Norfolk in which folks had been trapped and surrounded by environmental aggression. And it was just a horrible situation. So I certainly appreciate all of the work that you do, your work also and help to end the death penalty here in the Commonwealth was another. And the list goes on and on. As many of you have already mentioned, all of these different names and nicknames given to such a horrible strategy and procedure in Virginia's prisons is something that must come to an end. And I'm certainly here to lend my shoulder to the wheel to help get us where we need to be as a Commonwealth of Virginia. What's interesting to me, as Celine stopped by and we talked about this issue, and immediately I wanted to jump on board with your initiative, is what created the fate for the legislation last year, and that was to talk about the fiscal impact. What's interesting to me is what has anyone done a fiscal impact on what it takes to keep someone in solitary confinement or restrictive housing, as they call it? Because it does take a more intense pooling of resources, human resources, and targeted resources in order for someone to be in solitary confinement. The Justice Department really puts pressure on the jails, on the prisons, to make sure that there are certain frequencies of rounds and observations that are done when individuals are in these kind of situations, let alone overlaid on top of that, someone who may have already been diagnosed with a SMI, as they call it, a serious mental illness. And so if there are even more frequent rounds that have to be done to keep an eye on these situations. The question is, as the prisons are complaining, they have limited number of staff, they need more staff. Why have a practice where you're requiring 2 persons to constantly be there in that situation, overseeing and watching, when they could be freed up and be a part of the rather larger group that are working within the prisons themselves? This is probably something that's costing millions of dollars also. And so it's just a matter of humaneness that we keep people in touch with other human beings as opposed to leaving them isolated in those situations.
Yes, sir.
I stand ready to sponsor the bill on the House side and look forward to working with you. As I've mentioned, as Salim has mentioned, I have already submitted my bill. It's just a matter of legislative services assigning it a bill number. So we just want you all to be aware that on the House side, we have that legislation as well.
Thank you, Delegate Hayes. We really appreciate your service and your commitment.
Thank you.
Brother. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll turn it over to our Director of Communications, Ms. Aisha Taylor.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our esteemed host of panelists for giving us your time, sharing your profound thoughts. Let's hope that we get this done. I just wanted to add that I have thrown some resources in the chat. There will be a video made available right away. And then we've actually got a fact sheet. We've got the full faith statement available online. And so the link is available in the chat. And if you have any more questions, I've dropped my email in the chat. I will go ahead and drop it again for anybody who has further questions. And thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Continue
Yes,
to pray for the
yes.
success of this deal.
Thank you.
Blessings to each and every one of you. Thank you so much.
Have a blessed day, everyone. Thank you.